Okay, so here we are now with light, value, right, edges, and now contrast or contrasts. So each one of these together can be studied separately, or then they can be studied all together. We're going to separate them out and then put them back all together. Each one of them has an important role in drawing. Each one of them has an important role in making the drawing really begin to come alive, not only in terms of realism, but a kind of a full finish, kind of give you that sexy sort of finished, elaborate, velvety quality that a lot of representational drawings have, or abstract drawings, or even somewhere in between. So they all play a role. And so I'm going to do with this particular introductory video is give you some oversight from each one. Light and value and edges, separate them a little bit, but kind of talk about them all together. This one will be very short, but this one should be the first one you watch. So if you're skipping around, that's fine, but make sure that you watch this one, light, value, edges, and contrast, to get an overview so that when we go deeper into each one and spend quite a bit of time, we can separate them out, talk about their complexity, and then of course put them back together again. Okay, so let's go on now to talk about each one of these very much in a general introductory sense. All right, so let's move on. All right, so now we're starting out with light. Light, value, edges, and contrast. So the first section here I want to start out with that will again separate for a lot longer time is this idea of light. So L-I-G-H-T, right? We've got light up there. And the reason why is because it kind of governs everything else in a sense. And I've got this picture now of sunshine, and there's a reason why. So a lot of what we base our understanding of light on is the concept of natural light. So what is natural light? Well, you know, I'm not a scientist for sure, a physicist, but I know enough that light is photons, it's particles. And so you want to know a little bit about that. I think it's good to know a little bit about that. So we can say that light is photons, right? And it's particles. Okay, so we'll write this down, take this in your notes, particles. And we can also understand that if we block out certain parts of natural light, that the light tends to act in rays. So it comes to our eyes, where our eyes can see it in kind of rays too as well. So that I think that helps. And light is going to react on forms no matter what form we draw in a very similar kind of way. So that's what we're trying to understand, is not only light, but also how it reacts, or let's say that it gives form to objects. Without it, we'd be in the dark, right? So it gives forms, and it gives the idea of three-dimensionality, which is very important. So we have natural light. So what are some of the natural light sources that we can think of? So I ask my students at NKU this all the time. We get some pretty interesting answers. Well, you know, number one is the one I've got up here, which is the natural sun, or we could even break that down further into starlight, which is the natural, I say natural way we see things, but it's the light that we know the best. So sun in starlight's the one that everybody gets. And then we can also say that moonlight, right? So reflective light, which is indirect, so we'll say moonlight, light coming off, let's say in our case, on Earth, a full moon, bouncing back off a moon, and then coming back on. So we have that, and then maybe perhaps you could go to starlight and say, if it was a particularly clear night a long time ago before pollution, or out, you know, in the mountains or a desert area, you could have maybe some starlight, which might give you a little resolution to work from. But let's say you're doing a drawing or a painting at night. That'd be kind of tough to do too with just starlight, and maybe even moonlight. So what are some other kind of natural sources. Well, we could say lamp light, like lamp oil light. So lamp light happened when we had before electricity, right? Or how about if you're trying to get warm? How about firelight? You know, big enough fire, close enough, which could be also what? Candles. So firelight, and then candles, candlelight too as well. Is another kind of natural light source. So, and then a couple of industrial students said, you know, if you could draw really quick, how about lightning? Well, I guess you could if you were really fast. You'd have to be blisteringly fast, right, to do lightning. So that should be an N over there, but you get the idea. So lightning too, as well, I think would be important. But I think you get the idea that we have major light source, which is the sun. And of course, it's a natural light source. It means it's naturally occurring in the universe. So, you know, sun's made of hydrogen and helium, and there's a chemical reaction that gives off, you know, radiation and rays, and we have photons and particles. So our main light source is natural light, but there's another. It's artificial light, and let's go to that one. So now we have a different light source. So to mimic the idea of natural light, now we have, right, artificial light. So I'll put up here artificial. Okay, artificial light. And that's the kind of light source that we'll probably use more often in these lectures and demos. But it's a nice way to control light too as well. It doesn't move. It stays the same brightness. It stays the same incandescence mostly throughout. Sunlight, natural light, of course, it's going to move because we are rotating and the sun we're moving around the sun, and of course the earth is rotating too to give us days and nights, and so that's going to change the look in the feel of everything that we know about light. It's also shape and value and edges and things. So a lot of times we will study here at the university at NKU, we study through artificial light. And you know, there's a couple of sources. Those of you that are photographers or understand more about photography, you know that you have fluorescent light, right? I'm just going to abbreviate that. Fluorescent light, then there's tungsten light, which I'm familiar with. These two especially, we mostly use those. And now we have LED lights, which last longer and are financially more expensive, but they do last quite a bit. All of that pertains to now reading or illuminating the object. And so what is true of artificial light we get from a natural light source. So it mimics that quality of natural light. Now sometimes it can be harsher, and an experienced artist can generally tell the difference between an artist that's made an image that looks like natural light, or it was made from natural light from observation, or made from artificial light. Artificial light usually has a more starker contrast to it, unless the artist has adjusted that, where natural light is a little softer, a little bit more subtle, if you will, in terms of rendering objects. So there are some differences with natural light, but I think nowadays with enough adjustments and enough Photoshop and Lightroom that artificial light can be adjusted and tweaked and changed to make it look like a natural light source. So natural light generally is kind of number one, and that's where we kind of get our understanding of our history of art, Western traditions at least, with our understanding of light. And of course artificial light comes along and really helps us out in our modern or contemporary approach to understanding light on form. Of course, we mimic more Renaissance techniques, and then we study them, and then we either continue on with them, or we push them aside and we break those rules and go on to other fascinating ideas in art as well. But they haven't really changed, and that's the idea of our light and our light source. Okay, so I think that's important too. So in studying light, We'll get into the difference between artificial and natural, or natural and artificial. I think that's pretty important. And of course, that's illustrated here with just a simple still life and a simple one light source canister shining on or illuminating onto the objects. Okay, let's go on now to our next slide here in light. So let's talk now a little bit about breaking down light, how it reacts onto forms or illuminates forms, so we can get an idea of how this is quantified and how this remains the same pretty much throughout light on objects. So the first thing I want to talk about, is I haven't yet mentioned, is light direction, light source direction. I think that's important, and I'll get deeper into that as we go into our light lessons, is that the direction of light's important. So in this little diagram drawing of mine, the light source is mostly to the side of the object, shining down from above. So it's somewhere to the side, pretty close, sliding down and lighting onto an object that way. Why do we know that? A couple of things. The direction of over here, the shadow, is really important, and we also see where this area right in through here, the what we're going to be calling the highlight, and that's important. So direction of the light's important, right, as well as natural light or artificial light. Now later on I'll show you as we go deeper where we can move the light source all over the place, and that changes the look and the direction and the feel of shadows too as well. So in this diagram that I drew, and it's a drawing, is primarily a study or a diagram, if you will, an illustration of artificial light on a source. It's a little bit more contrasty and more stark. So it's not necessarily conceived from natural light. And this was not done from observation. This was done just out of my head as a diagram. So keep that in mind. I think that's important. Once you learn all these attributes, you can recreate them in many different looks and configurations as you want. Let's go into now the properties of light on form, and they're generally, as I understand it, there's 6 of them. And so that's kind of a bad 6 up there, but you get the idea. And I've got them laid out for you so you can see them. And we're going to commit these to memory. I want you to commit them to memory over time as you work on them, and you'll be able to rattle this off, and you'll be able to correct drawings as you need to. So keep that in mind. Now the first one is highlight, and that's number 1. This area, this really shiny area right in through there, that's highlight. That is the brightest, hottest, if you will, area of light hitting that surface, and it bounces back from that surface at about 45 degrees. So a highlight hits a surface object at about 45 degrees to give you that bright, shiny object area. And there are times when the highlight will show up really, really clearly, depending on the surface of the object, whether it's very shiny or glossy, then you'll have an obvious highlight, or if it's wet. But if it's not, if it's more matte, it might not even show up. But the brightest area of a drawing is the highlight, and that is receiving light at 45 degrees. Now number 2 is light form shadow. So think of it as we start to move away a little bit from our highlight and move outwards. We're going to go across this ball, right? So we start to move outwards. Number 2 is light form shadow. And I use shadow because everything that's not in light really is shadow, but it really means a little bit lesser light. So this area right in through here is lighter form shadow. A little bit less dark than the highlight. That's light form shadow. Now as we start to move further out and away from highlight and lighter form shadow, we get into areas that I call darker form shadow, and that's number 3. Of course, I've got it highlighted here or diagrammed down in number 3, and that's darker form shadow. So meaning that we're still on the light side of the object, Okay, we're still on the illuminated side of the object, and it's getting less intense as we're moving, in this case, across a sphere, right? And so we have less illumination, right? And so therefore the ball gets a little bit, or a lot bit darker, right? That's darker form shadow. So we have highlight, 45-degree highlight intensity, which is about the brightest area of your composition. We have number 2, light form shadow, getting a little bit darker, and then darker form shadow, number 3, getting quite a bit darker. And then we come to 4, and it's probably my favorite one. I don't know why I have a favorite, but I do, and that's coarse shadow. So it's down here at 4. So you see this area running through here? I'm demarcating it a little bit. This area is the boundary between light and dark, where light ends or terminates. Some people call it the terminator. I just call it the coarse shadow. That means it's the darkest part of the shadow where the light ends and the shadow begins, or the dark part begins. And it's really important because it helps us separate really quickly light from shadow. 1-2 step. I'll talk about that later. I'm just going to put 1 and then 2. 1-2 step. And hopefully this will be able to resonate later on. We can separate the light and dark really quickly, and where that separates is the coarse shadow. That coarse shadow, especially, it's a little bit lower because our light source is higher. It's coming up here, right? It's coming up from above. That light source, its direction, you can find the coarse shadow from its opposite direction. So if it's high left, coarse shadow will be bottom right down in here. You can see that. So that's coarse shadow, and that really gives us this strong sense of illumination. Objects' forms start to pop out a little bit. They start to look three-dimensional very quickly with the idea of the coarse shadow. Now number 5, let's go on to number 5 in our properties of light. That's reflected light, right up in through here. Now what's happening when a light source illuminates, whether it's natural or artificial? A light hits an object at a certain angle, of course 45 degrees, that part of the angle will be a highlight, but it also hits other parts of the surface down in through here. It's shining all the way through here. And I've got illuminated just a lighter table, and what's happening is the light is hitting that object on the table and then bouncing back onto the surface of an object. So you've seen this before when you've taken a photograph. A professional uses reflectors, like if you had when you were a child or younger, and you've taken your high school or middle school photograph, or wherever you're at in school, or your family portrait, and photographers have those reflecting shields. That's what's happening. It's illuminating. Number 5, reflected light, is illuminating the backside of the object, in this case the sphere. So all of that after the coarse shadow. Notice it's quite a bit lighter than the coarse shadow. That's important. However, notice that the reflected light is never generally, as a general rule, never lighter than anything in the other side of the coarse shadow on the lighter side of the object. Now there's a way to break that rule if you had multiple light sources. So if I had a light source coming from the back end of the object too, in addition to my regular light source, then that might break that rule, but then it also breaks down everything else on the object. So one thing also to consider in this shorter lecture is that we are talking about a one light source illumination situation where we're using just one light source to illuminate the object. I think that's very important because later on you can have multiple sources on an object, and that's important. So that's reflected light. Reflected light gives the shadow some dimension. Without it, shadows become very much one-dimensional. They become flat and dark. Comic book artists, graphic artists use that a lot in their work. Sometimes animators to simplify a drawing or a painting or a graphic piece of art into a more edgier kind of composition. Fine artists can use that, but think about Leonardo's Mona Lisa, how soft it is. There's lots of light in the shadows, lots of reflected light, or other artists that you admire. Go look for their reflected light. Okay? And then lastly, number 6 we're going to talk about is the cast shadow, and that gives, it's down here, that gives expression to the actual physics of light. So we have an object, light hits that object at a certain angle, right? But then it creates a shadow shape on, in this case, a table surface. It could be concrete. It could be a wall, for instance. It could be anywhere. It could be on itself. Your nose will create a cast shadow on your cheek, for instance, in the right angle of light. That's very important. Cast shadows form the physics of dimensionality, correct? So, and they're categorized by a harder edge, and we'll get into edges in a moment. So, those are your 6 properties of light. Highlight, light form shadow, darker form shadow. The core shadow, remember, it terminates the light. Where the light ends, the shadow begins, and then everything is on the darker side. Core shadow, reflected light, of course, and then our cast shadow to give the dimensionality of that form, physical space. And of course, the lower the light's way down here shining over, the longer that cast shadow would be, and we'll lose that cast shadow a little bit when it gets really long because more light gets onto that cast shadow. We'll talk about that in edges in a little bit. Okay, so there you go. You've got a hard, quick, and fast introductory understanding of light. And we will go into that much, much deeper in this particular part of the basic series. So look for that for the future. We're going to break down each one of them, light, value, edges, and contrast. We'll probably put those together and do quite a bit of drawings together where we look at how light reacts onto that. Okay, let's go on to the next slide and talk more about value. What value is and how it's actually different from light. Hey, before I forget, I don't want to forget, I got ahead of myself. Let me show you on a naturally occurring object too, or light on an object without the drawing. So this is actually a photograph. So forgive me for jumping ahead in my last slide there. We'll get to value in a moment. But this is now a photograph of a sphere taken. It's a little bit different from mine because the light source has changed a little bit. So let's analyze that before we go on to value. So where's the light source coming from? Well, it's coming from in front of us a little bit. So we can see it's pushed off right in this direction a little bit, and it's higher up. Okay, so it's higher. How do we know that? I'm looking for the highlight right in through here. And look at the direction of shadow. Look at that. So it's moving off. So it's moving to the right. That means the light source is more to the left. And it's moving behind us. That means the light's in front of us. So it's in front of us and it's raised up high. And what's the light source? The light source, I'm giving that to you. It's artificial. You might not be able to tell, but you more than likely probably can. All right, so let's pick apart and find our 6 properties of light. So we see our highlight, right in through here. That's 1. The pencil's a little thick, so that's 1. That's highlight. So moving across the ball, lighter form shadow. There's our 2s right in through there. 2 over here, 2 over here, even a 2 behind here. You can barely catch the edge, but it's right in through here. You can see it there. Then we get into 3s over here, right? We get into our darker form shadow in this area as it's moving across. So those are darker form shadow areas. And now do you see our core shadow? So number 4, right, is core shadow all along this area right in through there. That's our core shadow, the darkest part of the shadow. Now what about reflected light? So light's moving forward and shining down all over and bouncing on this white table, but then it's also starting to bounce up, and it's really dramatic right in through there where our reflected light is, and that's number 5. So there's our reflected light to give some illumination. And take a look at this backside. You can see it a little bit, but it starts to disappear about right in through there a little bit. I might lighten that up if I was drawing it, the artist, through as well. Okay, and then number 6 is cast shadow. You can see number 6, right in through here, the edge of that. Look how strong that edge is. It tells us really about the physics of the ball. Nice and crisp edge, and really dark. Look how dark it is right in through there, closest to the object, where the object really sits on the surface of that table. That's going to tell you a lot. And then look how the shadow gets a little softer about right in through here, right? We see that it starts to get softer. More light starting to come down from our light source and soften that up even further. So there's a photograph of our image of a ball that's not drawn. I wanted to show you that too. Okay, now let's go on to value. Sorry about that. Here we go. Okay, now we're pushing on to value. So what is value and how value is different from light? So a lot of artists, maybe a lot of educators, etc., I hear them talk sometimes about light and value as if they're the same thing, but they're really not. So we need to separate them in their respective categories. They work together. They're very much a team. So think of light and value as a dynamic duo. They are important to each other, but they also are a little bit different. Light is photons, it's particles, it illuminates. Value is light-dark relationships, and they can be abstract. They can also be flat. Okay, so you can have a piece of art. This could be an Ellsworth Kelly painting, for instance, if you know who he is. And even though there may be a light transition, we're not really illuminating a surface to make it three-dimensionality using light. It's all through value. So value is the relationship between lighter values and darker values to degrees of contrast that's set up, or to lesser degrees of contrast. And our study, remember, of light has 6 properties for a light source, uses the physics of light, and gives illumination to an object or a set of objects or to a picture. So they can be thought of as very similar, but they really are separate, and they can work together. They are a team, but sometimes they react alone. Value can react alone. Value can go on its own. Value doesn't need light, but light will always need value. Think about it. Something that's abstract could have light and dark relationships, but not the illumination of light. But for an object to be illuminated, we're going to use light and dark relationships. So value will always be included in a three-dimensional representational piece of art. So keep that in mind, so how they work together. So let's talk more about what we're looking at. This is a value, that's a little bit pixelated, but we'll get the idea. Value scale. So this is a scale, okay? Now, what does that mean to you? Well, artists, and especially in education, we like to quantify our understanding of value into different shifts of value. And here's what I mean by that. We can see value in hundreds and thousands of little different variations and shifts. But artists generally like to teach one another these contents in a value scale. And in this one in particular has 10% shifts from light to dark or dark to light, depending upon where you start. Now, this value scale is not exhaustive, and you'll see a lot out there. They can go from 0, which I like to quantify over here as absolute light, to 10 in mine, which is absolute dark. That's the extremes. Now, I've seen value scales that go from 0 to 100. The steps in between are very, very minor. They're 1% steps. Our steps get darker or lighter depending on which way you go in 10% increments. So it's a lovely little scale to have and use, and I'll show you how we can quantify that in a moment. So we can start here by labeling on the light end. Here I am over here at 0. The next value over here is 1, or it's a 10% difference between the one next to it. This one is 20% darker than 0. The next one, you guessed it, that's 30%, or 3 on the value scale, and it's 30% darker than absolute 0. Then we go to 4, that's 40% darker than absolute 0. Then we go to 5. 5 is right in the middle. It's 50% light, 50% dark, so it's right in the middle. Okay. Now, what's the difference between 4 on the value scale and 5? It's 10% different. What's the difference between 2% and 4% value on the value scale? About 20%. Let's keep going on. That's 60%, right? That's 70%, so 7. That's 80%, right? 8. This is 90, getting pretty dark, and then 10 at absolute dark. That's as dark as you can go with a full value scale. And then we do this also, some artists call it a grayscale. It's a monochromatic light and dark value scale. You can do this with color. You can do it with one color. You can do it with multiple colors, but because we're in drawing, we'll keep it monochromatic or grays, right? So going back to what I talked about a little bit earlier, the difference between these and how we can name and talk to each other now. So if I say that the difference between 3 and 6 is 30% dark, you can understand where I'm at on the value scale. So if I say my drawing needs to, in this area, is about number 4 on the value scale, and it needs to be, really need to push it to about an 8 or a 9, you know that it's got to be about 40% or 50% darker. And you know where that scale is. That's important. You know where the degree of contrast is. So the difference between 1 and 2 is only 10%. That's not a lot of contrast, right? And as 1 contrasts with 3, that's 20%. 1 contrasts with 4, that's 30%, and so on. The degree of contrast gets more extreme. So the largest degree of contrast on our value scale is what? The degree between 0 and 10 or 100, if you will. It's 90% different, 0 and 10. Now there's 11 spaces, by the way, on our value scale. You count 0. 0%, 1%, 2. That makes 11 spaces across. So what do we notice then about these degrees of contrast is that as they move stronger in value, they get a little bit darker to 10%. Now, another value scale could come along and fill in lots of those little steps between 10% and 20%. And that's how a value scale can get longer, a lot longer, and a lot more sophisticated, and thus more subtle. Anytime you have a value change, even if it's minor, from 1 to 2%, that's still a contrast. That's a contrast right there. That's a different contrast, right? That's a 10% contrast. This also over here, between 4 and 5, that's a contrast. And that's also a 10% different. Now, there's a bigger contrast between 6, let's just put a dot at 6, right, and 9. There's a 30% contrast. That's also, right, we'll put those out here and we'll label that. See, that's also a contrast, just a greater degree of contrast. So there are lesser degrees and there are greater degrees of contrast, but they're all contrasts unless they're all the same. That's important to keep in mind also with their value scale. Later on, I'll show you artists sometimes like to limit their value scale. They may just cut out 6, 7, 8, 9 and use 5 as their ultimate dark and 0 as their ultimate line and all the little steps in between. That's a more limited kind of value scale. If you wanted, say, really light illumination or a blasting sun or a desert scene or a polar scene, you might do that. What if you wanted a really dark scene at night? You might limit your value scale from 5 to 10. So there are different ways that you can use the value scale. Creating your own is a smart thing to do. I won't do it with the drawing database because it's so foundational. You can do your own, and you can do it in many different materials. But I won't go through that, but we will always reference and talk about value and value scale a little bit. So let me go on to the next few slides and talk about quantifying the scale and look at some student works that you may like and see how value is used to different degrees of light and dark and also contrasts. So let's move on to that one. And cut. All right, let's take a look at this student image. This is an image by Dean Reynolds, former student of ours. And let's take a look at what's going on here. So I have an image of his still life drawing, and then I have a value scale down below. And let's see if we can find some quantifying value. So we understand that this still life is they're objects, right, and they're illuminated. So there's a 3D component, right? So I'll write it up here, a 3D component to the drawing, and it's using light, represented by L, and then value together. So they're three-dimensionality. All the 6 properties of light are working on this form. All the edges situations, we haven't really talked about that yet, are working on the form. And we have various degrees of contrast, and we also now have value. So let's see if we can look down now at our scale here. So we have our scale, and see if we can take a look at the range of values up here in our drawing, and then quantify them down here in the value and see how they work together. Can you find the easier ones? So let's start at 0 here. Where are the ones that are 0? Where I can tell you right here is this little highlight on this pan right here. There's a 0, right? There's a 0 right there. There's a 0 right there. We see a 0 with the highlight on the light bulb. What about the highlights here on the little surface of the light bulb here? Also the glossiness on those little curvatures where it plugs into the socket along the border here of the edge at 45. So take a look at where the light direction's coming from. So we see the edge, this edge over here of this rubber cement can is moving a little bit away from us. So the light source is out here somewhere, and then up above, higher than certainly the objects. It looks like it's it's probably a little bit in front of us and then pushed over to the left, illuminating down on the objects that way. I think that's important to understand. So there's our zeros. Let's find some other easy ones. Let's find some 10s out here. So 10, really dark. Maybe this whole area over here, this cloth's a little heavy, a little dark. I might have even suggested he go back and lighten that up a little bit. There's a 10 probably underneath the table a little bit. There's a 10 value. So see how we can quantify this into scaling as well. Now, there's a lot more value ranges going on than just 0 to 10. That's the easiest way for us to quantify it, I think. Any value scale that's bigger than that, I appreciate it, of course. You could go to 0 to maybe 500,000 if you wanted, but what's the point? There are, again, quite a few steps between 0 and 1 down here. Lots, 10%, and you could break those into minutia. And we see a lot of those values. But for our purposes, and I think most everybody, you'll want to keep yours to about 10. Any more 10s out here? Some of the deep shadows maybe right in through here could be a 10. You can see where I mark that. Let's go find some 2s, about 20%. So not quite the brightest light, but getting close to that. Maybe as it falls over here, could be in the 2 range. Maybe right in through there on this kettle that's pushed over to the side, these lighter areas in through here. So I'm looking for, pretty light areas, but not quite totally dark. 2s over here on the light bulb, in the reflection of the light bulb a little bit. Maybe in the light of the can over and through here, we can see some 2s, and you could keep going with that. Let's find some 3s. Maybe some 3s on the table. The lightest part of the little scratchy surface, the wood part of the table, and through here. Maybe back in through here. Let's see. Maybe on this slightly darker part of the light bulb in here. Maybe on the hammer. That's a pretty good contrast. It might be more 4. We could even categorize that as a 4. 4 down in here. And let's just do one more. Let's go on and find some 5s in through here. So about halfway between light and dark, I'm thinking there's some good 5 ranges right in through here. So I want you to get used to hearing that vocabulary about value and value scale. So if you hear me say something, let's switch from 3 to a 6 in value range, or you're kind of in an 8, you really need to be at more of a 7 or a 6. You'll know more about where you're at with that scaling. So it's a good way for us, again, to quantify that. You can keep going. The subtle difference between 9 and 10, these are probably, for instance, all 9s and 8s right in through here, maybe some 7s. See, it transitions just a little bit. So 9, 8, and 7s in through there. And then, of course, you can find 6 later on. So let's go on to another image, and I'll show you how this student uses value slightly different. I would call this image overall very balanced. The image has a full range of value scaling. So I would call that very much a balanced scale in this sense. All right, let's go on to another slide, and let's look at a different use of value. All right, so with Jeremy's image here, you can tell, number one, it's a zombie image. He's really captivated by The Walking Dead. And I think he captures the spirit of the premise of that show, being kind of eaten alive by zombies. And the idea was to have a kind of a Siamese twin idea going on, and he chose the theme of zombies. So I think it was a really effective image. The value usage here is quite different. What do you notice about this image from the prior image? I would say that the use of value is less balanced. It's in the darker range. So I would call this, for lack of a better word, I don't want to say unbalanced, but I would say a dark palette, if you will, or dark balance. Maybe that's just as good. So dark balance in through here. All right, so let's pick apart the value range. Can you find in our scale a lot of the zeros? So there's ones, zeros, ones, and twos, and you find them a lot through the sides of the head or anywhere you see the light, right? You see a lot of that. I think that's interesting. The collar in through here, kind of where he's tearing himself apart. It's pretty fun in through there. But then it starts to fall away, and there's just slight usage, right, of 3, 4, 5, 6 in that area. So from 3 to about 6 or so, he's using a lot less of that range overall. So it gets really kind of like a graphic novel. Even in areas where you have these lighter areas, let me see if I can pop this image up a little bit, and I'll probably mess it up. Let's see. Yeah, I knew I'd go the opposite way. Let's see. There we go. Now we'll come back. Let's go forward a little bit. You can see in this usage in through here where those are probably twos, ones and twos against that really dark. These are probably 8s and 9s up here, kind of in variation. So you can kind of see where he's using that to various, I think, really good in terms of good use of the tone that he wants to express. And then, of course, we get into, again, the backgrounds are 8s and 9s and maybe some 7s, but a lot of this 7s, 8s and 9s, right? 8s and 9s over here, and 10s, hard edges, sharp edges. We're missing that range from, again, about 4, 5, 6, and maybe even 7. So this is a very dark, balanced image on the darker side. So he's eliminating a lot of the subtleties that you got with the first one, but I think in a way that speaks of the right proper tone of the use of value for what you want to express. So artists eliminate value, add more subtleties, or take away according to their needs. So it's right in this range from about 3 to about 6. There's less. It's still all there, but there's a lot less of it, I think, going on too as well. Okay, let's move on to our next image. Okay, so now we have a new image. This is an image by Claire, and it's a nature scene of a wooded area with fallen trees. And what do you notice about the value use here? There is a softness to this. There's not the harsh quality of very strong highlights or zero values, and the darkest darks are less too as well. They're both there, but maybe not even zeros. There are some 10s in through here, but there may not be absolute light zeros. Let's go find the 10s. There's maybe just a few. I can see one or few in through here, maybe in through here, but very limited use of absolute dark. And the reason why, she's dealing with more natural light look, where there's a lot more diffused light going on. There's a big difference between artificial and natural, is diffused light. We'll get into that deeper. So the range of contrasts are less so. There's a long, drawn-out, subtle, dramatic change between values that are way in between the percentages of our 10% shifts. 9, 8, right? 7, 6, 5, 4, right? 3, 2, 1 in absolute light. The shifts in between the 10% or even larger shifts are very subtle, and they take longer to get that. For instance, take this situation right in through here. What value range do we see through there? I don't think I see any zeros, and there may be a few ones in through. I think there's a lot of 2s and 3s, and I think we get into some of these darker areas that get us to 4 and 5. But look at the subtle transitions that go even further. So if we pull that even further right in through here, you can see that they really they all get to be quite complex. So the contrast between them are much more slighter. So this image overall is more, I would say, more light balanced. Okay, and I would also say that there's a gradual, I'm just going to put gradual shift, where in Jeremy's there was that stark, deep contrasting shift. Depends on what you want your image to read. Now, his type of highlight shift or light and dark value shift would not work for this image unless you wanted to show this image at night and somebody had brought out artificial light illuminating it. Then that might work for maybe there was a deep, mysterious, dark terror kind of scene. This one's light and airy and soft and not foreboding, and I think gentle, and that's what probably that's the tone I'm getting from the image, and probably the artist wanted that. So this range, let's take this big oval that I'm drawing here. What's the value range in through here? Well, I might see there might be quite a bit in these little subtle areas. There might be 10s, but I see a lot of 9s, right? Lots of 8s. Overall, this might be categorized, the whole thing together might be categorized as a 7, with little shifts from maybe 6 at the lightest end to 7, 8s, 9s, and 10s. But there's a softness to this image. The edges are a lot softer. Even our foreground image, and I'll get into edges in a moment, are still a little bit softer. We're kind of already covering contrast, really. But the edges overall get softer, and it gives it the overall sense of more diffused light, even though we can see, of course, that they still are harder edged than the complete background, but there is a generalized kind of softness. Take this value scale down at the bottom right, or this value situation through here. What's the value scale there? It's a little bit in the mid-range all over. So this is a mid-range value usage area. This one was a darker value usage range right in through here. And the one I showed earlier, this was a lighter value usage range. So if we go back to the mid-range here, I'm over here, is a big grouping of 4 to probably 7s, right? There may be some 8s and 9s over there, but mostly it's 4 to 7, and probably the whole thing hovers around 6 overall. So that's how she's using her scale. She's using a lot more between 0 and 10. Quite frankly, they all are. There's a lot more steps in between, but we can quantify this usage and talk about their value in a range or a scaling that makes sense for us, and it can become more complex after that. So I think that's important to understand and to get to start to get under your vocabulary and the way you look at also images as well. Okay, let's go on to our last idea. Let's talk about edges. We've talked, I think, enough about contrast. Let's go on to edges, and then we'll finish. Okay, so our last section, so edges. So we've covered light, value, and really mostly contrasts too. And now let's talk about the real subtle difference in stark difference sometimes with edges. I think this separates a pretty good artist from a professional, and that is the idea, ooh, that's big, but I'll leave it, is the idea of edges. Edges are so important. All right, let's talk about why and what we're looking at. So what are edges? Edges are boundaries, changes, shifts of light where it's obvious and sometimes soft, and how you handle them is pretty important too. Let's talk about the hard edge boundaries. So in terms of edges, let's talk about I'll write it hard. So let's talk about hard edges and what and why they're at. So hard edges are where an object ends. So the sphere, where right in through here the sphere ends, that hard edge right through there, hard edge there. Even on the shadow side, the cone, the edge, the boundary, that's a hard edge. The cylinder, that's a hard edge. The pyramid, right in through there, there's a hard edge. That's a hard edge. These have got to be crisp, clean, sharp edges that need enough value change to make them realize. You can use a line if you're line drawing, or you can use a value if you're valuing, but they have to be a clean edge. The reason why they're hard edges, because it's a couple of things. It's either the boundary of an object where the object ends naturally, or it's a plane shift. So take the pyramid, for instance. So we have a boundary edge here, but it's a plane shift where this plane moves back in space that way. It's moving in back that way. This is a boundary edge right in through here. This little tip's an edge. This is a boundary edge back towards us is a plane edge and shifting over. Same thing with the cube back here. There is a boundary edge. So this edge here is an edge. This is a plane edge, boundary edge of the cone, boundary edge of the cylinder, boundary edge. So anywhere, human figure or not, where you see an edge end, that's a harder edge. Here we have a plane change where the boundary of the plane ends, and then the new plane starts in the back, and of course it goes back, and then it ends in a boundary edge. So that's the first understanding of hard edges. We also have hard edges in cast shadows. Notice the cast shadows from the objects onto the ground. They're relatively harder edge. They're stronger, they're more intense. They show off edges, the quality of edges on an object. So the light source is coming from the top right, slightly in front of the object, shining to the back left. So over here on the cylinder, back in through here, hard edge. Now you can tell that the edge is a little fuzzy, and that's fine because that's where more light starts to get into the edge and start to soften it up. But for the most part, notice how hard edged those cast shadows are. Look at the edge of the sphere on the cube, a harder edge. Notice that the rectangular cube here, it casts a hard edge onto the table, and then because the cube's in the way, we can tell that the rectangular hard edge is also now on the box, harder edges. So harder edges occur, boundaries, I'll just put B for boundaries, and also cast shadows. That's very important. Okay, so I'm going to take this layer off, and then we'll go on to the same image and look at soft edges. Let's take a look at soft edges. Soft and hard working together. So let's go find the soft ones. So we know what the hard edges are. The hard edges are when we have boundaries. Boundary of an object like the sphere, or the cast shadow of the sphere, the boundary of the cylinder, right? Or the boundary of its cast shadow. What about the soft edges? Where are they? Those are called form shadows. Form shadows, you'll hear me say that a lot in the future. The soft, natural changes of the light on a form. Notice how soft that is, cascading across the cylinder. Nice changes, even across the ellipse of the cylinder. Those are soft, subtle value changes, soft edges. There's nothing hard edged on that. Even the change on the cone. Look at the soft, gradual value change, the softness of the sphere. Naturally occurring, the human body has natural soft edges until we get to boundaries. Look how these remain soft, 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 boom, hard edge, right? Soft, transition coming the other way, soft, 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 boom, boundary. Now, okay, I know the sound effects might be silly. I want to get it impressed in your understanding that the subtle differences and sometimes not so subtle make the difference in clarity of drawing and or painting an image or an object. Take a look at the plane of this box. There's two things going on. We have form shadow here, form shadow, form shadow. All of a sudden we get a little bit crisper shadow. Why? Because it's a cast shadow casting from the rectangular box down, right? So it's a little bit sharper, but it's a little bit more diffuse because it's not slightly direct. So it's still a little bit sharper than our form shadow. But then we get down to a boundary. Bam, we get a hard edge, right? But then we get transitions all in here. These are all soft, soft shadows, transitions. Hard edge. This is where it gets tricky. But inside the shadow, even over here in this darker area, those are soft transitions, less contrast. Soft, hard edge. Okay? Soft all over here. That's soft. Then we get to a boundary with the edge, hard edge. Take a look at the pyramid. Here's a great example. So the boundaries are all hard edge, but the transitions, it's not flat. It's a little bit light to dark. It's lighter over here and gets a little bit darker to that edge. There's a core shadow there, and we can push that. But everything through here is all soft. These are all soft, soft edges. Boom, boundary of a cast shadow, hard edge, even though it gets a little diffused, most of it's hard, but inside is soft, soft, soft. There's a lot of light here, but that transition is very soft. In through here, soft shading, and then boom, the edge gets hard edged. Soft over here, soft inside, hard edge because it's a boundary, soft out here to the atmosphere, soft, soft, boom, hard edge, and what do you notice? Soft, soft transition, soft. So where you end an object, where you change an object really makes sense. Let's look at one more diagram to make it clear, and then we'll end the video. Let's go on to that one. All right, so let's end our discussion with looking at Michelangelo's David. So the sculpture is illuminated by natural light, so it's softer overall, generally, a little bit less contrasty and more diffuse. So let me bring that down just a little bit just so you can see the whole image, and let me bring it back up now so we can break this down a little bit further into terms of edges. So let's find some, let's first figure out the direction of light. The direction of light, natural sunlight, diffuse, coming from overhead mostly. So do you see that? Excuse me, do you see that? Mostly overhead, illuminated down below, so the shadows are slightly bottom right in through here. So illuminated down above in through here, very soft, okay? So we see that direction of shadows. Where do we see soft transitions? There's a lot of soft transitions through here. Soft, soft transitions. Lots of soft transitions through the chest, the shoulder, even the arm in through here. That's pretty easy to recognize. But then you start to say, wait a minute, there are stronger subforms going on in certain parts of this object to make the darks look a little bit darker and the edges look a little bit darker. So we know that this is soft across the biceps, soft across the abdomen, the belly for the most part. But where his form ends completely, let's take a look at that. So we see, let's see if I can move this by my tool cursor here. I'll get the hand, there we go. Let's go up a little bit. The boundaries of his head, this boundary here, now I've got to go back, sorry. All right. The boundaries now are hard edge. These are very much all of that. See, notice the hard edges? Those are pretty hard right in through here. The boundaries of his arm, the boundaries where his nose ends, that's a hard edge. That's a hard edge where his neck is. You want to make that a fairly crisp and clean edge, whether it's a value contrast or it's a line. Now, if we go down a little bit lower, let's go down lower. Let's take the neck a little bit here. and analyze that. This muscle here, this sternocleidoid muscle that attaches to the clavicle, it gets a little bit darker down through here, and the edge gets a little bit harder. Why? This muscle starts to become, right in through here, a tube, like a cylinder, but it's so turned right in through with that dot where I'm putting my mark is, that gets a harder edge, gets a little bit darker, but it's not as dark as the hard edge on his shoulder, his trapezius, and his deltoid, or shoulder in through there. Why? That's a boundary change. We're still on the inside of the form in through here, so it's a little bit softer, but not always. Let me show you some more changes. Let's go over now to his hand, and I'll show you how complex and interesting hopefully this can get for you. Let's take a look at the hand now. So let's analyze it just like we did some of our simplified objects. On the edge over here, that's a boundary. That's a boundary. That's a hard edge. The wrist, hard edge. Wrist, hard edge. The finger coming over. All that's hard edge. Even the back of the finger is a hard edge. This finger's a hard edge, right? Coming across the form now, soft edges across here. Soft transition. See how soft it is? Softer edges. So those are all soft edges coming across. Same thing now with his chest. Even though we have the pectorals, a little bit of the rib showing through, right where the sternum comes through, it's still a soft change even up here. But notice this little cast shadow. Do you see it right there? See how it's a little bit harder edge? It's subtle and soft enough because the light source is above and it's diffused, but it's still a little bit of a harder edge. Here's where it gets trickier. Look at the hand. See the veins now, the arteries coming through the ligaments of the hand, actually. That's what that is. They're soft transitions, but because it's a subform, it comes up a little bit. It gets a little bit darker over here. Slightly harder edge, and a little bit darker to show shadow and to show a raised form, a tube on top of the hand. Here we have a boundary. Here we have a boundary, hard edge. Here we have softness in between. So all of those, to get the idea of illusion, if that's what you're going for, which you probably are, is you need to start to reconcile hard edges, right, versus soft edges, and when to use them. Hard edges you want to use on boundaries, right, where a form clearly ends, or cast shadows. Soft edges on form shadows. So let's go up to the head and analyze a little bit of that head further. Okay? So boundaries. Where are some boundaries besides just his head? Well, we have the boundary of the contour. What about boundaries of the hair? Anywhere you see a harder edge, these little hair, this curly hair, Michelangelo sculpted it. It's a harder edge, really hard. End of the nose, the bridge of the nose, some of the lips are a little bit harder edge. But notice the softness of the graduality of the face. Beautiful, soft, no hard edges coming across there because there's no bone material that's truly a hard edge. These hair ringlets, they're little separate groupings of blocky forms, cylindrical forms. Where they end are harder edges. But anywhere you see softness, even in the dark, some of the soft in the forehead, that's a form shadow. So again, you're always reconciling hard edges versus soft edges. Even in the eyes, I know it's a little pixelated, but even in through here, this whole eye region, there's a lot of soft changes in the brow, then it gets hard edges, and then because this is like a ball sitting through here, the eyeball, anywhere you see a hard edge is where one form boundary ends and another begins. So I want you to be aware of that. And of course, all that's categorized by a great degree of value and also value contrast. So the object is illuminated. We have light, and it's 6 properties of light. Then we have value, right? And you can quantify this image into terms of its scaling, right? Then we have edges, hard versus soft. And then we have all the little changes in contrast, some strong and stark, and others are more subtle. So light, value, edges, in contrast. And we're going to spend a great deal of time in the basic section, but also later on with the figure and more advanced techniques especially really later on as we go through this. And you will grow as you begin to understand these relationships of light, value, edges, and contrast. But in addition to, not exclusively from, but in addition to line, spatial understanding, perspective understanding, of course later on color and texture and other areas. But this is probably the grouping of four that students want to most understand, at least in the beginning, but it's probably the hardest grouping, especially light and value and edges, to really pull off. So we'll spend a lot of time there. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. It's probably a little bit longer than I wanted, but it's important. And stay tuned. Slowly I'll start to make instructional videos that will tackle all of these four attributes: light, value, edges, and contrast. Okay, I'll see you soon out there. Take care. Bye-bye.